Well, it is 5 o'clock, so we will begin our webinar with Diane Boyd. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We're very excited about this webinar. So Diane will be presenting, and following that, we will have time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So to do that, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. If it doesn't show up, you can just hover towards the bottom and a little menu will pop up. You can click that Q&A tab and then type your questions in there. I will ask them out loud to Diane, and she will answer them live. The webinar is also being recorded, so all of the registered participants will receive a link to the recording in about a week. So you can type those questions into the Q&A tab at any time during the webinar. However, we will be getting to those questions after Diane's presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Grant Spickelmeyer, the Executive Director of the International Wolf Center, to formally introduce Diane.
Thanks, Krista. Thank you all for joining us. I'm so glad to share this evening with all of you, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Diane Boyd. She has been a friend and collaborator with the International Wolf Center for many years, although I have personally not gotten to meet her before as the new executive director, so I'm really excited to hear of her work. I was just looking back in the International Wolf magazine from 2019, where we were highlighting leading women wolf biologists, and Dr. Boyd's work is incredibly impressive. Over 40 years of research on wolves in Montana. So I think we have a lot that we can learn from her tonight. So I do have the formal bio that I'll read to everybody so that you can know a little bit more about Diane. Dr. Diane Boyd began her career in 1977 with Dr. Dave Meach, who is our founder, and his wolf research project here in Minnesota. She moved to Montana in 1979 to study gray wolf recovery in the Rocky Mountains. And from the first naturally recolonizing wolf to approximately 2,000 wolves today in the Western United States. So just that whole spectrum of time. Her work is focused on wolf ecology, dispersal, habitat use, prey selection, behavior, genetic relationships, and the social dimensions of wolf-human conflict resolution, which is incredibly important. She has collaborated on research in the Rocky Mountains of the United States, British Columbia, Alberta, and the Mexican Wolf Recovery Program, as well as collaborations on wolf research projects in Italy and Romania, which may be why we have some folks from Italy on the call tonight. She received her BS in Wildlife Management from the University of Minnesota and her Master's and PhD from the University of Montana, and she's presently an affiliate faculty member at the University of Montana. Diane did recently retire from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, where she was the Region 1 Wolf and Carnivore Specialist. Thank you, Diane, for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the International Wolf Center for this opportunity. And I want to thank all of you for joining in. I hope this will be thought-provoking. If you would have asked me 40 years ago when I moved from Minnesota to Montana and we had one wolf, if you would have asked me then if I would ever have thought that there would be a couple of thousand wolves in the western US and wolves in California and hunting and trapping seasons, I would have said you're out of your mind. It has been such a successful story, and I'm so excited to share it all with you. So what I'm going to talk about today is wolf recovery in Montana via dispersal. These wolves got here by walking here from Canada from 1979 to present. Wolf monitoring and management by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. We're going to talk a little bit about Western wolf recovery through dispersal and reintroductions. It's been a good combination. And then we're going to conclude by talking about some of the challenges due to the huge success of wolf recovery in the West. They're kind of going to be everywhere. So some people like that and some don't. A little bit about basic wolf ecology. Most of you who are watching this have great information about wolves already, but some of the things that make them a really successful recovering species, the fact that they're a social carnivore and they live in family groups. So there's lots of assistance from other pack members to help provision pups and ensure their future. They're terrific dispersers. That was one of my most interesting things that I've done in my research, is following the fates of these dispersers. They're highly territorial. They really defend their territories even to the death. They have high fecundity, so they reproduce at a very high rate, and they can recover pretty quickly when they're knocked back. They're highly adaptable, which when I was starting out my research in Minnesota in the 70s, I thought they were strictly an animal of the wilderness, and we learned they are not. They will live anywhere, we'll tolerate them because, as a last point, they're habitat generalists. They can live in the Arctic, they can live in the deserts of Mexico, they can live anywhere as long as they have prey base and security. So in about the 1930s, wolves were killed off all over, about 90% of their historic range through US and Mexico. They never were much affected in Canada and Alaska because there's so few people there. There's not many conflicts. And then we kind of had a cultural shift with Alda Leopold, Rachel Carson, and so forth. And people began thinking more about ecosystems and wild places and endangered animals. So the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973 and wolves were protected. So I was in Minnesota at that time. Bob Ream, who's a faculty member, he's now deceased, unfortunately, but he started the Wolf Ecology Project in 1975. And he had born and raised in Wisconsin. He was very passionate about wolves. And he'd hear about a wolf report or a cluster of sightings or a track. And he would have students, friends, dogs, whatever, go look for that sign and see if they could confirm if there was wolf present or not. So lots of people went out there, and we never really could confirm that there were any wolves out there in the early 70s until in 1978, Bruce McClellan on the right, who's a grizzly bear researcher, was seeing sign of a single wolf in the North Fork of the Flathead, which is the western boundary of Glacier Park, right up against the Canadian border. Joe Smith on the left, who's from Minnesota, he works at Camp Ouija Wagon, if you guys know that. He came out, Bob hired him to come out in that winter and try and catch this wolf. And Joe did indeed succeed in catching this wolf. And does my cursor work? Are you seeing that? I don't get any response. Okay.
Yes,
anyway,
that does work.
Okay, thank you. So this wolf was named Kishnina after a creek in the region, and we put a radio collar on her. She was a middle-aged female wolf. She traveled alone. We were disappointed there wasn't a pack, but we followed her through the winter on skis. We tracked her in the summer. We flew once a week. We really kept tabs on the movements, behavior, food, whatever, of this single wolf. And then a three-toed male showed up that winter of 1981. Before that, there were no other wolves. And over the winter of 81, 82, they were doing pair bonding work, and sure enough, they became a mated pair, and they produced the first litter of wolves in the Flathead in decades. And they denned about 10 miles north of Glacier Park. So the one litter was in 82, and then there were 7 pups. The male was killed immediately while those pups were little. We were worried, but they all survived. They made it to the next year, and eventually another breeding female came in, and the next litter born in the North Fork of the Flathead was not again until 1985. So we don't know what happened to Kishnina, but this next wolf that came in, we got her too, got a radio collar put on her. And the thing that's really important to understand about the wolves of Montana and the northwest part is that these wolves walked down here from Canada. They dispersed on their own. There basically were no wolves south of Jasper Park by the 1960s. All the wolves have been killed out of Banff, Kananaskis Country, Waterton, just like we killed them down here. So that Kishnina had to come from hundreds of miles to get here. And slowly, over time, more and more wolves trickled down because they were protected here, and they found their way down. So the wolves were not brought here by people, they walked. This was a really exciting time because in 1986, considering the first wolf was here 7 years earlier, it wasn't until 1986 that they actually denned in Glacier National Park. And this is the picture that I took of that actual den in Glacier Park, about 12 miles south of the Canadian border. And then by 1987, we gave the name Magic Pack to these wolves because it kind of showed up magically, and it was magical that they had survived in Montana, which is not particularly wolf friendly. And so that's a picture of the pack. And so from that pack, we had more dispersers, we had more wolves come down from Canada, and wolves just sort of kept trickling out and forming satellite packs, and the process began. And it was all because of Kishnina was the springboard that launched wolf recovery. Up to now, where we have about 2,400 wolves in the western states. So when we were early on in the project, that's a picture of Mike Fairchild and myself taken in 1986. We did all the usual things that the scientists do. We looked at the population, the demographics of the population, why they lived, why they died, how many were born, movements, dispersal, what they ate, how they interacted with grizzly bears, lynx, mountain lions, wolverine, and coyote, and black bear. We have all of the predators in this ecosystem that were here originally. We looked at genetics eventually when I did my PhD, but 1980s, there wasn't genetics work, as we know now. We looked at disease and parasites. We were really looking at the ecology of recolonization because it was a big deal, and there wasn't a lot of places where wolves were coming back. They were just starting to come back in the Midwest as well. And we looked at habitat selection. This could not have been done without the amazing, amazing volunteers. We had dozens and dozens of volunteers over the years who worked for nothing. They lived on scenery and landscape and top ramen, and they worked their butts off to collect information for us. And I still keep touch with a lot of them. They've gone on to be pretty amazing conservation professionals. So people nowadays, you have to remember back then, in the 80s, there was no GPS, there were no cell phones, there was no spot devices. If you fell through the river ice, you were SOL. There was no DNA work, there was no laptops, and where we based out of, we didn't even have electricity. So, but we would carry on. We would go up and fly about once a week, more if we could do it with the weather. And I remember one flight, we were searching, Dave Horner and I, most amazing pilot. We're up in the little Super Cub, and we're up at just about 10,000 feet and just flying north and doing grid searches for dispersing wolves because we wanted to know if they were colonizing other areas. We kept flying and flying and finally heard a signal that was very faint, and we kept flying towards it. It got louder and louder, really exciting, and then we started coming down. We had the wolf in our circle, and then you could see her, and it was February, and it was obvious that this wolf had joined for other wolves, and it was quite apparent that the male of that pack wanted her to be the new breeding female. She was being courted. It was so exciting. I said, yes, Dave, yes, where are we? And he said, beats me, because we just had a bag of paper maps. So, and I looked at him and he says, tell you what, I'm going to fly and you read. And he just dropped the airplane out of the sky, and there was a frozen, snowed over highway, and he put the skis of the airplane about 10 feet above the lanes of the highway, flew up the highway till we went past a couple exits, Fitzsimmons Creek, Strawberry Creek. I was writing them down, and then off we went. And then I went and drove to Canada and bought the maps, and she was way the heck up in Canada. But that was kind of early efforts, pretty simple techniques. There's been a huge evolution of survey techniques, and my God, Doug Smith et al. Are just doing amazing work. Early on, a lot of our work was very hands-on, snow tracking, howling, plain old-fashioned VHF collars. Now we've moved to GPS collars. I've been collaring wolves here the last few years with GPS collars, and I can put the collars on and not this time of year and sit in my office in January and have my cup of tea and my scone and look where the wolf has been and what she's doing. It's really remarkable. Patch occupancy model, which is POM, which we will discuss in a little bit. DNA work, camera trapping. Camera traps are some of my most favorite tools. Drone work, we're beginning that. And now we actually do some infrared camera work as well. And it's basically gone to more remote work that's non-invasive. One of the most amazing little wolves we had, Wolf 8551, she was 78 pounds, just a little thing. And I collared her in Glacier Park. And in 1987, she took off in December, and we just lost her because it wasn't a satellite or GPS collar. And 7 months later, she was shot up by Fort St. John's. So I caught her here in Glacier. She dispersed through Banff. She went through Jasper. She went up through Hinton, and she went to Fort St. John's in 7 months. It's 550 straight miles. What's interesting about this is Hinton and Fort St. John's are the two places where the wolves were captured for the study, for the reintroduction to Yellowstone. And if that little wolf had gone south, she would have been about 100 miles south of Yellowstone Park. So we knew in 1987 that this was one ecosystem for wolves running from Yellowstone almost to the Yukon. So she was pretty phenomenal to document that. So while we were doing our work up here in the northwest corner of Montana, we had wolves going to Missoula, we had a wolf went to Idaho. The Rocky Mountain Wolf Recovery Plan for the reintroduction into Yellowstone and central Idaho was underway. You all know the story. There was one of the most successful reintroductions that I can think of. So about 66 wolves were taken, and half were put in Yellowstone and half in Idaho over the winters of 95 and 96. This is kind of a fun map, just to give you a little bit idea about how wolves travel. So this is a paper by Jimenez et al., which I'm a co-author too. And Doug Smith, and all the people in the West, this is a map of the dispersals of 297 wolves from 1993 to 2008. And just to show you how far they go. And my little wolf that went way north isn't even on this map. So they really can make a lot of difference. And this data is quite old now. It's, 12 years old. So since this data was made, there would be 2 to 3 times as many arrows. Oops, didn't mean to do that, sorry. They went to Utah, they've been to Colorado, they've been to Nevada, on and on. But wolves live by their feet, as the old Russian proverb says, and if they don't get shot, they will just keep going. So our Montana minimum wolf population, and in those days we did minimum population. So if we saw, we had X number of packs and we knew that there were 50 wolves, it would be a minimum number that there were 50. There could be 100, but we did minimum estimates from 1979 to 1995. So before the reintroductions, there were at least 70 wolves here in northwest Montana that had all gotten here by walking. They were not introduced. So some of the things that Montana wolf management covers, very interesting, the wolf recovery goals were met in 2002. And those goals were set by the state, and it was to have 150 wolves or 15 breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years. And we hit that goal in 2002, and then they just kept increasing and going up. So wolves are doing very well here. Our conservation and management plan was accepted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2004. So we were kind of there, but due to litigations and some of the foot dragging for other states and the legal ramifications, the wolves actually didn't get delisted in Montana until 2011. And they were delisted in Idaho and Montana together. And they were supposed to be delisted in Wyoming as well, but Wyoming did not have a management plan that was acceptable to the federal government to ensure the viability of the population. So they kind of drug their feet, and eventually in 2017, compliance was met, and then they were delisted there. So in Montana, our wolves are classified as species in need of special management. So they're not a fur bearer, they're not a predator, they're not a varmint, they're not a big game animal. It's the only species in the state that has that classification, and it allows it a lot of management flexibility. So the hunting season started first in 2009, followed by a trapping season starting in 2011. And we've had those seasons every year since then. And I have some data that will show you what the results are. Our entire wolf management and monitoring program is funded by the sale of wolf licenses and Pittman-Robertson dollars. PR, Pittman-Robertson, is taxes that goes on binoculars, ammunition, sale of rifles and guns. It's basically supported by the hunting industry. So the program costs about $400,000 a year. Excuse me, the wolf license sales amount to about $400,000 a year. It's a lot of money for the department. About 20,000 licenses are sold every year, and there is no limit to the number of licenses sold. So theoretically, everybody in the world could come to Montana and buy a wolf license and go hunt wolves. It's unlimited. The only place where there's quotas is there's a little thin band along the west side of Glacier Park and the north side of Yellowstone, just a little buffer. But other than that, there's no quotas, sub-quotas, and every person who buys a license can buy up to 5 licenses and can take 5 wolves per person. USDA branch called Wildlife Services investigates and resolves the depredations, not the state of Montana. The Montana Livestock Loss Board pays compensation for wolves livestock confirmed killed by wolves, and they pay out $65,000 to $85,000 annually. Now, there's a lot of livestock losses that aren't confirmed because they're just eaten, they're gone, but that's about what it amounts to. And then, interestingly, there's a law that the legislation passed in Montana that requires Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to collar every pack that might come in contact with livestock. That means really every pack in the state of Montana, except for one in the very north corner of Glacier Park that doesn't come out. But it's an impossibility. You cannot catch and collar every pack in the state of Montana. It's too remote. So that's something that can't be fulfilled. But that's the thing. So The biggest challenge for management of wolves is the ranching and hunting community. They have a very vested interest in maintaining their livelihoods, and most of them, not all of them, but most of them feel that the wolves are a threat to their livelihood. So a big part of my job is working with the ranchers and the hunters who are not necessarily thrilled to have wolves back. But I've got some great collaborators and cooperators, and we've done some really interesting projects together. So first we'll take on the livestock industry. This is a chart that shows the number of cattle and sheep killed and the wolves killed for depredation. So starting here in 1990, we go up to 2019, and you'll see it just kind of sputters along because there was hardly any wolves. And it starts to climb up, and then the line you want to watch is the dotted line. That's the number of wolves killed for depredating livestock. And as the depredations increase, the number of wolves getting killed keeps growing until about 2009 and 10, and then it just tapers off. And why that happens is because there was a minimum response put on at first as the wolf numbers were low and kind of incrementally removing wolves, and then it became apparent that if there's a problem, we just remove the pack. And it came down pretty aggressively and hard on the wolves, but it reduced depredations significantly, and it's kind of stabilized. This is a shot from February of 2009, right outside of the Fish, Wildlife and Parks office in Kalispell, Montana. A protest in February, and it was about 15 below zero, and they were all up in arms, these are hunters, because the wolves was debating on whether or not to open a season on them. They wanted the season open. There were several hundred wolves here at the time, and they wanted the number of wolves managed down to 150. And we tried to explain, states tried to explain that we are required to maintain a minimum of 150, and it's going to have to be some buffer above that. But they weren't so bad, but they were pretty vocal. And I think this guy here who says wolves out of control, Montana out of patience, maybe should have looked in a thesaurus or a dictionary. Anyway, okay, so the hunting community, the biggest concern that I've heard expressed over and over and over is the wolves have eaten all of our deer, all of our moose, all of our elk. Actually, hunting is pretty darn good in Montana, and there's quotas are not reduced hardly anywhere. So first of all, that's not a true fact, but it doesn't matter because it's in their mind. And I've spent a lot of time talking, and I talked to a lot of rod and gun clubs. What I tell them is there are 3 times in Montana where the wolves live, there are 3 times as many mountain lions as there are wolves. So you can presume that lions kill 3 times as many big game animals as the wolves do. They're a big animal. They weigh as much as a wolf. They have the same caloric need. Hunting techniques are different, but they all eat. Of course, there's hunters. I'm a hunter. There are grizzly bears, which are fairly effective at depredating or at catching elk calves. There's wolverine, there's coyote. There's hundreds and hundreds of deer and elk are killed on our highways every year. But the biggest challenge for big game is winters. And I took this picture of a bull elk that's very, very, very close to death in the middle of winter, just starving. And about every 10 years in Montana, we have just a hellacious winter with deep snow and very cold temperatures, and it really, really kicks back the game populations. In 1996, 97, we had a really terrible winter, and we had a huge white-tailed deer study up here in northwest Montana, and 40% of the white-tailed deer died. And the wolves were impacted by that for a couple of years. They didn't produce pups and so forth. So then eventually the deer numbers came up and wolf numbers come up. I mean, there's always this kind of constant flowing dynamic. That's how it goes. So you can tell people all this science, but the wolves have killed all the deer and elk and moose. So we're always trying to give good information. Outreach is so important, and to not get mad. Just don't get mad. Just get good information out there. So the patch occupancy modeling, if anybody's really interested in more detail, I'll go into it in the Q&A, but I'm just going to give a quick run through what it is. Basically, as the wolf population continued to expand, it became impossible to keep track of them all. It's a densely forested area, road densities are low, a lot of wilderness, a lot of snow and ice and rocky mountains. You just can't get there. So we went to this method, patch occupancy modeling, and I'm going to call it POM. So it's an estimate of the whole population, not a minimum count. So when we say 900 wolves, we mean there's 900 wolves, not that we know there's 900 and it could be 2,000. It's the count. It's more cost efficient because it doesn't take so many people. It's probably more accurate. There's good confidence intervals, about 95% confidence interval on the estimates. And as of 2019, it became the method by which Montana counted wolves. No longer do minimum counts. Biologists just gather enough data to feed the POM model to make sure we understand the ecology of the wolf so we can build this model. So the whole state of Montana is gridded into patches, and a patch is 600 square kilometers, 232 square miles, which is about the size of an average territory for a wolf pack. So you can see the squares here. The way the numbers are estimated is Fish, Wildlife, and Parks every year after deer and elk season's over in the middle of winter, they call people who have deer and elk licenses, moose license, and they ask them if they were successful or not. They ask a whole bunch of questions. Then at the end, they say, by the way, did you see wolves? Then they can say yes or no. And then if they say yes, well, how many? Where were you? So they build this model, and there's a lot of assumptions built into it. It's too long to go into in this webinar, but again, I can send you a reference. Basically, the green squares here mean 0 probability. No wolves were seen. The light green, maybe one was seen in a week. Yellow, orange, they saw wolves 2 or 3 times. Red, wolves were seen a lot. So this is 100% probability. This is 0%. The colors in between represent variation of probability. So you take these percentages, you add up the probabilities, you multiply it times the average pack size, and you get a number for the number of wolves that were there. Okay, the results of this. So this is looks complicated, but this green line here is the one to look at. So follow the green line. That is the number of wolves. Okay, so you see it peaked in 2013, and it starts to decline. It keeps declining, and by the time you get over 2019, it sort of stabilizes. So these early estimates, just the plain white bars, are the minimum counts. Like I said, we were still doing them. And we still started doing them when they were doing POM, but you can see the minimum count is about 35% less than the actual number of wolves out there, which is very true. The red line is what we're required to maintain at 150 wolves. The black line is wolf harvest. So we started in 2009. There was no season in 2010. And it goes up and up and up and up, which is interesting because the number of wolves is going down. There's a few reasons for that, and partly people are getting smart about how to get up on wolves, trapping them, calling them, using predator calls. People are catching on how to do that. And so the confirmed livestock depredations is this dotted line. You can see it peaked earlier. Remember, we showed you that it peaked in 2009. And it just goes down. And it's at some level here now where there's some kind of an equilibrium with the livestock growers. It's not such a hot button anymore. Some of the things that go into building this POM model, as I mentioned, is data from the actual biologists in the field that are looking at where the wolves move, how big the territories are, how big the packs are, and where the wolves are living. So there's many things, but the basic parts that most of the POM is built on. The area that's occupied, well, how many square miles in Montana have wolves in them? The assumption is made that the territory size remains the same, and I put an asterisk on this one because it's not quite true. Sarah Sells is doing her PhD at the University of Montana, and she found that the pack territory size is actually decreasing slightly. Territory overlap is slightly less. It's stable, but it's kind of means it changes the same. The interesting thing to me here, and these are all the same years from 2007 to 2019, when POM started in 2007. So pack numbers went up and up and up and up till about 2013 and started decreasing. So the number of packs, pack size is decreasing. So we used to have about 7.6 wolves per pack and went down to about 5.9. So pack size is getting smaller. And then the assumption built into the model is that the percentage of dispersers and loners in the packs in the population is the same. We call it 12.5%, and that's what kind of everybody uses across North America. And all those things funnel together to build our palm. And this is the same graph. The black line in the center here is the green line I showed you. Just cleaning it up so you can just see the population estimates with the confidence intervals on either side. And so it's plus this or minus this, but that's the number. So most wolf mortality is human caused, and that's true almost any place you look at research that's been done. So here in Montana, we have legal mortality, hunter harvest, and we have illegal. On the right is a picture of the wigwam pack, which it was a pack of 10 that I was studying, and 9 of the 10 were poisoned one winter. This is a graph. It's kind of busy, but just look at the trend. The color bars are years. So every bar represents a different year, but the category is the same. So this is legal harvest. You see for the number of mortalities that recorded, which we know, of course, we don't know all the mortalities. It's obvious there's going to be a bias towards harvest because they have to bring the bodies in to be tagged. So the legal harvest results in the most mortalities. Agency control is for depredations. The 10J rule, defensive private property, shoot on sight. This is another livestock issue for private property owners, can kill them in addition to the agency. Cars and trains, we get quite a few wolves run over by cars and trains every year. And then we have the illegal column, and the next grouping, which isn't on this graph, would be unknown or natural, which would be parvovirus, old age, carcass too decomposed or whatever. And it's about the same size as either car, train, or illegal. What really struck me is when I was putting this together for this talk today, I went through and estimated the percent of the population through POM, and this is the population, not minimum count. I keep stressing that because us biologists for years did minimum counts. The percent of the population harvested through shooting and trapping. And then we have here the percent of population harvested plus control for livestock depredation. And I look at these numbers, and these aren't so great, but they keep going up every year from 2009 to 2019, and up and up and up and up until last year we harvested about 36% of the population, and when you throw in the livestock depredation, that's 43% of the population that we know of that's being killed legally. And I thought about that one. Oh my gosh, that you know, how does Montana's wolf population remain stable? Because it was declining and now it's flattened out. We'll see in the next couple of years. But how does it remain stable at such a, well, relatively high level of harvest? When I was reading through data, and Sarah Sells for her PhD, again, is doing a lot of analysis on this with a lot of modeling. But basically, all those numbers I showed you, the pack sizes are getting smaller, the home ranges are getting smaller. Therefore, we're used to one pack of 12 that would live in, you know, 500 square miles. Now you got 2 or 3 packs of 5 or 6 living in that same area, and then you have each of those females reproducing. So basically, there's more females reproducing. Additionally, we have increased dispersal, and that causes increased mate choices. So the population is constantly reshuffling and resorting. And I mean, we can talk about the morality of that or not, but packs don't get to just live out their lives here. They're constantly being killed and sorted every year. So fortunately, we have these wonderful trail cameras. I set this up at our rendezvous site, and the bottom line is our wolves are doing so well because they're just really cranking out the pups. And we don't have multiple litters per pack in Yellowstone. We never have. Even when packs were larger, we just don't have multiple litters. So the ticket is to have smaller packs, more females breeding. So where do wolves survive? Well, wolves have the widest historic range and present range almost of any mammal in the world except for human, because they're habitat generalists, they're prey generalists. So they can live anywhere as long as there's an adequate supply of wild ungulates, ungulate being a moose, elk, deer. If they have large undeveloped landscapes with refugia, and it doesn't have to be wilderness. Montana is not all wilderness. We got wolves living out in the suburbs of Missoula, literally. We had wolves come through the city of Kalispell. They've been filmed on police car dash cams. I mean, it's crazy, but they need the refugia where they can get away and raise their pups and survive, even if they're getting shot out on the more roaded areas. and they need freedom of persecution, freedom from persecution by humans. So, talking about lots of mortality. Well, the good news for the western wolves is that the Northern Rocky Mountain Wolf Recovery Area has now become an extension of the 15,000 wolves that live in British Columbia and Alberta and beyond. It's a meta-population now that runs way the heck up into Canada, now through Yellowstone and central Idaho, and now into Washington and Oregon, and it keeps spreading. There's no evidence of inbreeding. Now, Yellowstone Park is a little more isolated because it's kind of down on the end of the peninsula of that extension, but they do come and go enough. I don't believe they detected any inbreeding in Yellowstone. So wolves are dispersed to Oregon, Washington, Utah, California, Nevada. One of the Yellowstone wolves dispersed to the Grand Canyon. They will keep walking until they run into a trap or a bullet or a car. So in most of the West, wolves have been delisted. And if you saw the news, it's just broke in the last couple of days. The Trump administration is going to delist wolves theoretically throughout the United States, with the exception of maybe Mexican wolves or something. Anyway, in the Midwest, delisted by the end of the year. So I'm just going to do a little progression. This is where wolves used to live in the United States. They basically lived everywhere except not in coastal California. By 1970, when I wasn't even born yet, just kidding. I was in high school. Wolves only lived in northern Minnesota, Isle Royale, maybe a few hanging around northern Wisconsin and UP, but very, very few. Probably more likely just northern Minnesota. I don't think that map is quite right. And then as of about 2015, this is where wolves are coming back. That's quite an extension in the Midwest. We have the red wolves here. We have Mexican wolves here. And I kind of chuckle at this because I thought, oh my gosh, in 5 years, this thing is really, really outdated. So I'm working on a book chapter with some other wolf biologists, and we created a new map of this is wolf range right now as of 2020. And there's quite a few wolves that have made it around. Here's the Northern California population. These are wolf populations with packs as of 2020. So how many wolves live in the West? Well, here's a chart. I won't go through all the numbers because you can read. You can read them. Hopefully my screen is big enough. But interestingly, Idaho stopped counting wolves in 2015. They have so many wolves. They have to maintain 150. They know they're above that. So they monitor their wolves through camera work, basically, and DNA. And Dave Osband has done some amazing work using cameras, DNA, along with some other biologists and PhD students. And they don't collar wolves anymore. They haven't done it in years. So radio calling wolves is not essential to get your basic population information. If you're doing heavy duty research, that's different. So there's the states, and we include Oregon as of this summer, has 14 wolves in the pack. Northern California's got 8 pups and 6 adults. It's really amazing. So we've got over 2,400 wolves in 400 packs just in the Western United States. I mean, that is astounding to me when I think when I came out here in 1979, there was one wolf and we had a radio collar on it, and she was so precious that, you know, her mortality would have been really delayed the whole process. And then you go to Europe, and Luigi's on here, and maybe some other folks from Europe, but the same story has happened in Europe with wolves dispersing to the most amazing places. So 30 years ago, there weren't wolves in Germany, for example, or France. And now wolves have moved into France, Switzerland, Germany. There are even wolves now that have made it to Belgium, the Netherlands, and Denmark. I find that phenomenal. If you look at the kind of habitat these wolves are going through, it's not exactly what we Americans would think of as wilderness. They go through some pretty high human density landscape, and yet they're making it through dispersal, no reintroductions. Wolves are really resilient. So our next battleground for wolves here in the US is Colorado. And I keep reading the headlines. It's getting more and more interesting every year. I love the subtitle in here. Should democracy take over where science ends? And what that's about is there's a successful move that got enough signatures to put a ballot initiative to be voted on this November, whether or not Colorado should introduce wolves. it has created a huge fight. And I can tell you, looking at both ways of doing wolves, we can have an interesting discussion in the Q&A if you'd like about dispersal versus reintroductions. There's pros and cons. But these are the confirmed sightings in Colorado in the last 15 years that I have tracked down that have been confirmed by Colorado Parks and Wildlife, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, of collared wolves, dead wolves in hand, wolves on cameras. Most of them are, there's a body involved or a radio collar. So the one that's in the photo here was a collared wolf from Wyoming that made it down to Walden. Yeah, they're there, and they have been there for at least 15 years, and more are coming. So if we're seeing these individuals, and mostly who are collared, you can presume that there are others, and probably more, because a small percentage of the population is collared, presume that there's other wolves there. So I broke these into two groups. These are single wolves. The bottom bar are packs of wolves, a pack in Colorado, just one. In 2019, there was a wolf pack seen in Moffat County. They did some DNA tests on scat, and they found that 4 of those wolves were related close enough that they were presumably siblings. So if you have 4 wolves in the pack that are siblings, I think it's probably a pretty fair assumption that they had reproduction in Colorado. This year in 2020, the pack was seen in the same general area. 6 wolves were confirmed by Colorado Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Yeah, they've got photos of them, they got film of them. And this summer, July, a wolf pup was seen with an adult by a Colorado Parks and Wildlife employee in the same area. And I have not seen anything more on that. Haven't seen it confirmed or denied. But I'm just saying there's been pack activity in Colorado. So wolves have gotten there and are there. So it's interesting to think about natural dispersal and reintroduction. There's definitely benefits and drawbacks to both. So if you go, I kind of think Colorado is like where we were in Montana in the early 1980s. It's like, oh, a single would come down and make it or die and not make it, and then it'd find a mate and they'd have pups, and then maybe they'd be killed, and maybe they'd wait 3 years and one would die, and then 3 years they'd have a pack, and then it suddenly hit critical mass and took off. I think Colorado is where we were in about 1982. So natural dispersal in Colorado is already happening. A reintroduction involves a lot of planning. Natural dispersal is kind of free. Reintroduction can be very expensive. Dispersal is, this is the most important point to me, is I can tell you from working in the West here that these wolves that are in Montana will ever be thought of as invaders because people think they're reintroduced and they were not. So there's better social acceptance with wolves that walk there and have time for people and wolves to learn to adjust to each other, like they've done in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Montana, and so forth. There's more public resentment if you put wolves in and force people to live with them. That's just my experience. You can agree or disagree. I'm just telling you, after 40 years, that's what I've concluded. The problem with natural dispersal is it's a slower recovery rate. Reintroduction affords a very quick recovery. You can throw in 30 wolves in Yellowstone Park and boom, you got this population that's just doing very well very quickly. Natural dispersal involves a native wolf. The reintroduction involves what we call super wolf. So I can't tell you how many times I have heard people tell me about the super wolves that were reintroduced to Montana. And I go, oh, really? Yeah, when them folks went up into Canada, they went up there and they caught these wolves. They weigh 150 or 160 pounds. They have 8 canine teeth. And they selected the wolves that were the most aggressive fighters in the traps to bring down so that they would survive. Honestly, if I had $1 for every time I've been told that, I would be wealthy. It's a belief, even though it's untrue. So then some natural dispersal, the wolves generally are fully endangered and reintroduced. They can be non-essential experimental, or, we'll see what Colorado comes up with. Some of the themes that Colorado needs to think about is this: are we doing a natural dispersal, allow them to come in? Are we going to do a reintroduction? Or are we going to do an augmentation, which is a combination of both? With livestock, Colorado is a very important livestock state. You're going to have control. You're going to have compensation. You're going to have some proactive prevention methods like range riders, wildlife service employees, fladry, etc. There will be a lot of perceptions of the impacts to big game hunting. So you got to be lined out in front ahead of the hunters. They've got to be a part of the plan. You're going to have regulated hunting and trapping of wolves. You're going to have a way to monitor the population. You can use collars, DNA. There's a million ways to do it. Probably going to want to have some research. Outreach and education. That is the way to make people understand better. And how you're going to fund the program. How do we create social tolerance? I'm finishing up here. I've got about 1 more minute here, and then we'll open it up for question and answers. So in my mind, the best way to create social tolerance for wolves is you have to create a value for wolves. And for all of us watching this program, we're all going to have a different value for wolves. If you're a motel owner in Gardner, Montana, wolves have an economic value to you for the wolf watchers coming in. If you're a scientist, wolves are going to have an ecological value for you. They're fascinating animals. It's just amazing. If you're a person living in New York City, maybe you'll never get to see your wolf, but there's an aesthetic value that they have to you. You can enjoy them on the Discovery Channel, or you can enjoy just knowing that they are out there being wolves. If you're Native American, maybe you have a cultural value. It's important to you as a people. Knowledge, if you're a researcher. Recreational opportunities. If your goal is to get out there and harvest a once-in-a-lifetime trophy wolf, maybe that is your value. Maybe that wolf is really special and you will treasure that memory and that hunt forever. Or maybe your recreation is non-consumptive. Maybe it's standing on the side of the road in Yellowstone Park watching wolves. Those are all valid values, and we all have a different value. So I hope that generates some thoughts for discussion. And with that, I'll wrap it up and say thank you. And there's a lot of people and a lot of wolves up there to thank. And I'm sure I missed a lot of people, but there's a gist of it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Diane. That was really awesome. And we do have some questions. So just a reminder to everyone, if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So if you hover your mouse towards the bottom, a little menu should pop up. If it isn't already there, click on the Q&A tab, and then you can type in your question. So one question that we have so far is, how much do male and female wolves weigh in Montana? Are they larger than Minnesota wolves?
Yes, they're probably about 20% larger than Minnesota wolves. So I started working in Minnesota, and I've trapped and collared wolves in Minnesota. So the average adult female here, average adult, be probably 90 pounds, 95. Average adult males can be about 110. I have caught 2 wolves out here that are over 120 pounds. So they're bigger.
Great. There's quite a few questions about what a wonderful presentation it was and how informative it was. Do you know anyone who works in the Northwest Territories or even with the Sami people of Northern Europe?
The closest I come to is, I think about Dean Clough up there. He's up out of Yellowknife. Karin and Mats Eriksson in Sweden. I don't actually know people in Sweden and Norway, but I'm sure I could find something if you wanted me to, who's actually doing wolf work. Scott Brainerd just moved to Sweden. He's a researcher with the university there. There are people doing work. I'm not that closely in touch with them. I'm sorry.
Great. In places where wolves were reintroduced, how did the coyote populations that established themselves in the absence of wolves respond to the wolf packs returning?
Like a lead balloon. Sorry. No, I have to say, so when I started here in Montana, we had the one wolf. And when I did my master's thesis, I studied the habits of the one wolf and all the packs of coyotes and pairs of coyotes in her area. And as time went on and the wolves began to recover, there was a very, very notable change in the dynamics and location of where these coyotes made a living. So, and then a woman came along, Wendy Arjo. She did her PhD in the 90s when I was doing my PhD, and she studied that same dynamics and was doing a comparison. Basically, when the wolves came in, they pushed out the coyotes. They killed them directly. They outcompeted them. They killed their pups. And that's exactly the same thing that they've seen in Yellowstone. So when wolves come back, they kill coyotes. They drive them out. They're pretty hard on coyotes. The benefit, one cool thing that's come, it's become obvious as having coyotes gone, and I love coyotes. I think they're really cool, amazing animals, is with the coyotes disappearing, the red fox come back. So since wolves have come back in the Norfolk, now we've got wolves, we got red fox all over the place. And I never saw them when I first started my work, never. And now they're quite common. And I think you see the same thing in Yellowstone because wolves kill coyotes, coyotes kill fox, but wolves and fox, their niches are separate enough, they just don't compete that much. So they kind of leave them alone.
Sure. Have there been any use of search dog teams to acquire wolf scat for developing population estimates?
There are Megan Parker and there's several people, the Working Dogs for Conservation group. If you're interested, look her up. Working Dogs for Conservation, Megan Parker. There are many, they can train them to do anything, but I don't really know of anybody in the United States that's doing that work here because nobody really cares. I mean, there's wolves everywhere and scats everywhere out here. But there may be places where wolves are just coming back where a scat detection dog would be really good, like the Netherlands or some place where there's just one, or maybe you're looking for a specific rare type of wolf, a Mongolian wolf or whatever that you want to do. But I don't know of anybody looking for a wolf scat here in the West. Maybe one of you has that connection, but it's not a priority here.
Sure. In the slide with the 3 maps, in the Today map, what wolves have settled in northern Maine? Was it the Algonquin wolves?
There's no wolves in northern Maine. I can go back to that map if you'd like and try and, I don't think, there shouldn't be any wolves in Maine. There's the coy wolf kind of animal, but there's not wolves to the best of my knowledge.
Sure. Now that you are retired, will you continue to be active in wolf education?
I am.
Yes.
Here we are. Yes. Yeah, and I teach, I lecture, I'm doing a bunch of writing. I've retired from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. I have not retired from wolves, and I have not retired from wolf conservation and research.
Great. Why didn't wolves inhabit coastal California? Was it because there were not enough large ungulates? And then the second question with that is how strong is the wolves' dependency on ungulate prey in general?
So the first part of the question, you know what? That's a really good question, and I didn't draw that map. So I mean, in my mind, I think, well, why weren't they there? Maybe the map's wrong. I don't have an answer, but you know what? It made me curious now. I'm going to look that up. For the second part of the question, are wolves, so it kind of depends on where they live. So these really larger wolves here in the West, they're very dependent on ungulates. A very small percent of their diet is beavers and smaller prey. In the Midwest, some places I've read beavers can make up 40% of the diet of these wolves. They're a high fat, they're a very desirable animal of calorie-wise for wolves. And different places like red wolves, they're a lot smaller. They live on small things. They live on deer and rabbits and other things. So it kind of depends on the size of the wolf. Midwestern wolves have a mix of moose and beaver and whitetail and then other stuff. But wolves do not live on mice and ground squirrels. They just don't. So Farley Mowat was pulling your leg.
Yes, he was. Have you seen any evidence of collars increasing mortality rates? Thinking about the risk of getting caught on tree limbs or catching in small spaces, things like that.
I haven't seen it. I've collared a lot of wolves in my life, and I've never had a wolf die from that. And I have seen wolves that I've collared as pups with padding and extra spacing so they can grow into it, that grow up to become the breeders, the alphas. And so it does not affect their status. If it did, they wouldn't be leading the pack. So I'm a believer that, if you're conscientious and careful as a researcher to do a good job, the mortality rate should be very close to zero, but there are occasional times when a stick could catch on a collar, a wolf could get a paw through it. I mean, these things do occasionally happen. So I guess the question is, if you're concerned about that, what is the trade-off for the knowledge gained in terms of conservation, management, protection, the trade-off for one in, who knows, 1,000 or less that may suffer something from having that collar?
Are you optimistic about continued wolf dispersal, especially into areas like Colorado?
Yes. Wolves will keep going. And I believe, even though I'm old, I think that in my lifetime, we're going to see wolves in Utah and Nevada and Colorado, because there's a lot of unoccupied public land. I don't think wolves are going to do very well in Nebraska and Iowa and Illinois. They've gotten there, but they don't make it. They don't stick. And I think it's going to be quite a while before we see wolves stick in Utah, because they're not very friendly, wolf friendly there, or Nevada. But I showed you that list of those wolves that have made it to Colorado. They're pouring in. There's wolves going in there. Probably, I'll bet you probably every year or every other year, there's wolves that make it. We only know of a few, but there's a lot of them that have gotten there, and now they've started breeding.
Sure. So here's a comment from Old Two Toes. So your comments on the reintroduction to Colorado, the pros and the cons are excellent. Likewise, as mentioned in Wisconsin, natural recovery commenced in the late 1970s and followed the same pattern as you described in Montana. It works, just in time frames that are slow. Another thought to consider is, do you think that the self-directed repopulation by wolves themselves ethically elevates the effort?
That is a great question. And I'm glad Old Two Toes asked that. So I'm a believer in recolonization through dispersal because of the horrific social anxieties and ill feelings it's caused by reintroducing wolves. And I go to Yellowstone at least twice every year, so I loved watching them. But I firmly believe that they would have gotten there in my lifetime without the reintroduction. We'll never know, so we can't. There's no point arguing. I'm just telling you, ask what I believe, and I do believe that morally and ethically, to take any animal out of its native place and move it somewhere else always has a lot of risk involved, and maybe it's not acceptable, maybe it is. I mean, that's really an ethical question. I'd like to know what Two Toes thinks.
Well, let's see if he answers.
He's got time to write.
Along those same lines, in your opinion, if wolves were reintroduced in Colorado, would their predation on elk be the same as in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho?
No, it's never going to be the same in any two places. So it will be different, but there are a lot of elk in Colorado. There's prey-based, they support it. I mean, if you look in the wolf, it's not a management plan, but it's an advisory team that drafted up a document for them quite a while ago. And there's a lot of prey. So when there isn't enough prey, the wolves stop having pups. I mean, they won't be able to reproduce. They starve. So it's sort of self-limiting. It's really more of a question, I think, of will humans who depend on that elk tolerate the competition? In my mind, that's what I'm seeing here in Montana. We are not here in Montana where the wolves live. We have a number of elk, but this is not an elk state like Colorado. People don't pour in from all over the world that come hunt elk in Montana like they do in Colorado. So it's going to be a really big issue.
Sure. Do you have, and you just touched on this a little bit, do you have an idea on how wolf populations will respond to cervid populations that are starting to show decline from chronic wasting disease?
Oh my gosh. That's a question we could do a whole seminar on, just that. But there's some people who believe that wolves will slow the spread of chronic wasting disease because they can detect infirmities in an animal long before we can see that it's sick, and they will kill them. And when an animal is diseased and passing thousands and thousands of prions from the chronic wasting disease out through its urine and saliva and poop and everything else, every time it takes a step and the wolves kill it, that's one less animal spreading the disease. There's that school of thought. Chronic wasting disease will be everywhere. I mean, back in the Midwest, you guys have had it there for decades. You still have ungulates, you still have wolves. It's not the end of the world. It's just another, it's like COVID. It's another pandemic. And some will survive and some won't. And in terms of impacts wolves will have, They don't, number one, they did some testing on coyotes in a captive facility, and they actually fed them brains from chronic wasting disease infected ungulates and fed it to them. And they could test the wolf's or the coyote scat for how long after they consumed the diseased animal did they pass the scat. And I believe it was 3 days maximum. And then they didn't pass it anymore. I mean, wolves don't get chronic wasting disease. They don't carry it. They don't pass it on. They can poop it out for 2 or 3 days, but it's done.
Sure. Do you have an idea on why there are multiple breeding females in some packs in Yellowstone, but you said it's not usually seen in other areas?
I've wondered that for decades, truly. I mean, I would like to say it's prey-based. I don't know. I would love to have that conversation with Doug or Dan Steller. In Montana, I can honestly say I can't recall any packs off the top of my head that have had more than one breeding female, even when the pack is large and even when they're in Glacier Park and they got a lot of prey. So I suspect perhaps the biomass available, whether it's bison, elk, deer, whatever, in Yellowstone, the pounds of biomass must have something to do with it that we don't have up here. But I don't know that answer. It's a very good question.
Wolves are encroaching on urbanized places in Minnesota. Is that strictly attributable to increasing numbers? And do you believe that wolves are innately fearful of humans? And the third part of that is it possible that collective wolf behavior has fundamentally changed in recent decades by conditioning?
So you're going to have to repeat them one at a time.
We'll do one at a time, yes. The comment is that wolves are encroaching on urbanized places in Minnesota. Is that strictly attributable to increasing numbers?
I think it's a combination of increasing numbers of wolves and increasing human tolerance. Both, definitely. I mean, I've seen human tolerance increase, and I also think that people living in urban areas are generally more pro-wolf than those living in rural areas, and so perhaps they're better tolerated.
The second part is, do you believe wolves are innately fearful of humans?
I think that in wolves, there's a huge range of behaviors in individuals, and I've seen it. And there has to be for them to function as a pack. I mean, if every wolf in every pack was fearful, or everyone was very bold, they could never function as a unit to hunt because they'd be competing for the same status. So within each pack, there are individuals that are timid, there are individuals that are bold, and they each have a role in the pack. So I don't think wolves innately fear people, no. And as time has gone on here in Montana, those early dispersers, they were more fearful of us. And now I see a wolf in the North Fork, they've been there, 40 years, and they'll stand on the side of the road and kind of look at you. You would never have seen that when they were first coming back, because their experiences, their cultural history was that every time they saw a human, they were shot. So I think the fact that we are more tolerant, that the wolves have become less fearful of people over time. I'm talking here. I can't speak for Europe. I'm just saying here in North America.
Great. So, and you kind of just addressed that, but the third part of it, if you had anything to add, is it possible that collective wolf behavior has fundamentally changed in recent decades by conditioning?
Yes. I think Yellowstone is a good example of that, because when the wolves first came back, they were harder to see, and they didn't have any problems with any kind of boldness or wolves getting so close to people. And as time went on, I mean, those wolves in Yellowstone cannot avoid being around people because people are in their cars, people are in spotting scopes. The wolves try and cross the road, people race up in their cars, and Rick, bless his heart, is out there trying to manage all this stuff. The wolves in Yellowstone have to learn to adapt to people. And they learn to kind of become, I don't know about conditioned or habituated, but unafraid. And it's people are part of their landscape. And then they leave Yellowstone and they're killed. It's very quick. They don't make it very long. That's why Yellowstone has this problem of wolves exchanging genes. It's enough. It's enough migration to keep it from being inbred, but it's not as great of an exchange as we see elsewhere. So yeah, it changes over time.
Great. And can you tell us any more about the den in the photo from your presentation?
Well, it was in, I don't want to give the name of where it is. It's a specific spot. It's about halfway between Polebridge and the Canadian border. It's in the North Fork of the Flathead. They use that area periodically still. And I had to laugh because it was, it's kind of down between a couple of roots, kind of yellow gold colored roots. And so when we went back and found it, we named it the Golden Arches, kind of like McDonald's. So because it was pretty spectacular den, but they still use it, that area, not the same hole because they cave in over time, but the same general vicinity. I don't know what else somebody wants me to say about it, but they produce pups there. They were successful. It's a very secure spot.
Great. And to follow up to the chronic wasting question, she said, I would love to attend that CWD talk about wolves, but do you think it will have an impact on policy choice making when it comes to population regulations, especially now that the public is starting to get more and more knowledge of CWD?
I guess I'd have to ask population regulation of the wolves or of the ungulates, because I'm not clear. Maybe help me with that, and then I'll answer the question.
So if our listener can, Courtney, if you can answer that part of it, I will re-ask that question.
Thanks. Meantime, we'll take another one, then I'll go back to that one. Thank you.
And this is kind of a big question for you, but can you speak a little bit to the delisting of all wolves across America?
How much time do we have? Oh, my goodness. So what I would say, and there will be some people who aren't going to like this, but the Endangered Species Act was created to help species on the verge of winking out to recover. And those recovery levels are determined by professionals, biologists, managers. What level is needed, like in Montana? So originally it was 100 wolves in Wyoming, 100 in Montana, 100 in Idaho, together 300 wolves or 30 breeding pairs. And then Wyoming kind of buggered out, wouldn't play. So then Idaho and Montana split that in half. So 150 and 15. Anyway, that was the level that was determined for population viability because we're pretty closely connected to Canada. They hit that level, and then due to litigation, it couldn't be opened until the wolves were quite a bit above that level. And they're doing fine. So my point is that people who don't want to see wolves delisted in the Midwest. So when I left Minnesota in 1979, I believe there was about 900 to 1,000 wolves in Minnesota. And Dick, I don't know, in Wisconsin in 1979, maybe there was 10, 12 wolves. There weren't a lot. There were very few wolves. Less than probably 1,100 wolves in the entire Midwest. And now there's 4,000 or 5,000 wolves. And if people are complaining they can't be delisted because there aren't enough. Well, biologically, ecologically, they have hit recovery. And if we are going to say, because we're passionate about wolves, and we don't want to see them shot or trapped or whatever, if we're going to say they can't be delisted, I just feel it's wrong. The fact is that makes a sham of the Endangered Species Act. It has been determined what those levels are at, and I don't like to see a pile of dead wolves out there either, but you saw my data. We're killing a lot of wolves out here, and there's still 850 wolves here just in this state. So I guess I would ask people to put the heart stuff aside and look at the politics and the ecology, that if we create an Endangered Species Act that we don't follow because we're working with emotions instead of science, we are really not helping out wolves. If you want to create social tolerance and see them recover. And that's how I feel.
Great, thank you. Courtney responded, so just to review that question, do you think it will have an impact on policy choice making when it comes to population regulations of the wolves, especially now that the public is starting to get more and more knowledge of CWD?
It could. I think it depends on, it's really up to state agencies, because state agencies determine the harvest season on their ungulates as well as their wolves. And if you've got good biologists and scientists working for the state agencies, they will tell you that CWD, the wolves probably aren't going to have any impact on the spread or control, really either way. I mean, at one point when wolves were coming back, there were people who were anti-wolf that were trying to use Echinococcus, which is a tapeworm that wolves carry, to stop people from reintroducing wolves or to kill more wolves. Echinococcus has always been, it's been around a long time, and it's in native wolves, it's in native dogs up in northern Alaska. It can affect people, and if it gets into us, because we are not the designated host for it, we're a, you know, it can be harmful to people. But all this cry about echinococcus, I mean, we had legislation passed in Montana by the lawmakers about echinococcus and wolf-related stuff. Nothing came of it, and you know what? It kind of died a quiet death, and it went away. And I'm thinking with CWD, we're going to see changes in our game populations, and I feel strongly that we're going to see a decrease in deer now, and now we found it in moose here too, deer, elk, and moose numbers because of CWD. And it's from that aspect, you know, the regulations may change to try and knock the wolves back a bit, but they're already unlimited harvest. I mean, how much more can you do?
Sure. We have another question about are livestock growers commonly using guard dogs, and are they successful?
Livestock growers are using guard dogs. They're very, very effective with coyotes. They're not so effective with wolves. And I was just reading, and if you're interested in an annual report, I was just reading that this last year, the wolves killed 3 livestock guarding dogs. So the breeds of livestock guarding dogs that were used, some are more effective than others. And there's doing, yeah, I mean, wolves will kill guard dogs. It's really unfortunate. I'm a real wolf and dog person both. But they can be effective if you've got several dogs and you've got a small pack of wolves. But if you have a pack of wolves come in and you've got one Great Pyrenees out there, it's going to be a pile of white fur and blood if those wolves want to get in. So I think you could look at it either way. I think livestock guarding dogs are better than nothing. And people use, I think, but the more important, I mean, if we just had people out on the landscape with their livestock like we used to, that's the most effective deterrent. You can use flattery, you can use, there's a lot of devices you can use. So guard dogs are one tool that is pretty effective, but it's certainly no guarantee.
Have you done any studies on the Mexican gray wolves in Arizona and New Mexico?
I worked on the Mexican Wolf Project in 1998 for the state of Arizona as a biologist, and I was one of the people who was fortunate enough to open the gates in 1998 and let the first wolves out into the Blue River area. And very, very splendid and satisfying, and they're really struggling. So in terms, I just worked with that for 1 year.
Great. So there's a question that says, so biologically, if we were not reducing the population through predation and hunting, would the behavior of wolf reproduction slow?
I can speculate, but because we can't test it, I can't say for sure. But prior to the wolf harvest season, the population, it was self-regulating, just like it is in Yellowstone, just like it is in the Midwest. Wolves don't keep reproducing exponentially forever. They run out of territory space. They're very territorial. They'll kill each other. I mean, in Yellowstone, I think wolves killing other wolves is the biggest cause of death. And they'll have food issues. So I think if there were no seasons, those wolves would find a new balance point.
Great. And how low is too low for populations of wolves to drop in Montana that would trigger a concern and need for some sort of mitigation?
150.
150.
And right now it's about, well, 833, but you say 850. So there's a long way to go down before it gets to that point.
And along with the population, if wolves are already delisted in a portion of Utah when there are no wolf populations in that state, why do they have them delisted in parts of Utah?
I think you need to talk to somebody from Utah who's politically savvy.
Okay.
That would not be me in Utah. Sorry. I mean, it's all based on politics. It's not based on biology. So I'm not a politician. I don't understand what the social needs and politics are in Utah, as well as I understand them here.
And do you have a book regarding your experiences and studies about wolves?
I'm working on it right now. I'm actually writing a book.
Dan, your audio is cutting out just a little bit.
Sorry, is that better?
Yep.
Okay. I actually am writing a book. Yes, it's not done yet. I'm working on it. And thank you for asking, whoever asked, but it's at least 2 years out yet, but I am working on it, and I anticipate it will be informational and fun and have some laughs and have some tears, but give people a lot of ideas about wolf conservation and what the wolf is and what it isn't.
Great. And another kind of big question, but what is your sense of Colorado's acceptance of wolves?
Depends if you're talking about Denver or the ranching community. They're completely different. So they have the east side and the west side, and they're as polarized as the Republicans and the Democrats. So I can't speak for all of Colorado, but the ballot initiative is going to be voted through by the people who live in Denver and Boulder.
And lots of really great thanks. This is just a really great way to look at things and helping people understand the delisting and the endangered species list. And another question about the Mexican gray wolves. Do you suspect the Mexican gray wolf will go through a genetic bottleneck, or is there enough immigration into their populations to prevent inbreeding?
That is a great question. I was actually on a panel with National Academy of Sciences, and we looked at the Mexican wolves and the red wolves, so all these things published it last year. But Mexican wolves, the entire captive population was started from 7 individuals that were captured out of the wild, of which only 5 actually bred. So the bottleneck really is 5. Sometimes you hear it quoted as 7. That's it. There is no more new genetic material. So if you look at what's happened to Isle Royale, the same thing has been happening to Mexican wolves. And they are working very hard, the geneticists and the scientists, to manage that population to maximize genetic diversity. And they have captive facilities all over the country. And they're taking pups from, say, a zoo, say in St. Louis, at Tendy. And they're putting some of those pups, because of the genetics of those parents who bred those are really different. None of them are really different because they're so close, but more different than the wolves that are in the wild in Arizona. And they would take a couple of those captive pups and they put them in the den of the same age 10-day-old wolves in Arizona. It's called cross fostering. And that way they introduce a little more genetic diversity in the population. But in terms of a lot of it, they can't. It will never be able to escape that issue by using Mexican wolves. The only way I could see getting out of that dilemma, and they are inbred, they're quite inbred. The only way I foresee out of that is if some Mexican wolves were allowed to disperse north. We know that a Wyoming wolf got down to the Grand Canyon, and if the Mexican wolves were to interbreed with gray wolves, maybe in Colorado, that would be a very interesting situation, and that would be one way of introducing new genetic material in them. But then they wouldn't be pure Mexican wolves anymore. But you would lose that inbreeding problem. So, what's the lesser of the two evils? What are you trying to manage for?
Right.
It's a good question.
It is a good question. And Old Tutos responded and says, we feel reintroduction has its place in extreme situations, but keeping the natural world as natural as possible is always the best approach.
I agree 110% with that.
And Diane, thank you so much for sticking with us. Do you have time for maybe 2 more questions?
Yeah, I'll stick around as long as people want to ask questions. I'm here.
Great. There's somebody that is interested in what the title of your book is going to be.
It hasn't been officially accepted yet. So the publisher hasn't accepted it, but I have a title in mind.
Great.
So do you want to, we'll just let it go at that because it's not official yet.
Okay, perfect. We'll leave it kind of hanging out there for some excitement later. And if licensed harvesting of wolves is to be permitted, would that also include, I guess this depends on where, include poisoning, trapping, aerial shooting, and hunting, and should that be a limited season?
Another very good question. So people in Montana and Idaho can harvest, in Montana you can kill wolves, legally harvest them through traps and shooting and archery. In Idaho, they add neck snares onto that, which is pretty horrific because you kill everything in a neck snare and you can't release it if it's not something you want. If you catch a lynx in a neck snare, it's dead, or a mountain lion. On the other hand, it's kind of humane because they die right away versus hanging around in a trap. So it's, anyway, there's no poisoning legally anywhere here. Aerial gunning is done for control programs. It's not done as a means to harvest wolves here. It was done in Alaska for a while, aerial hunting of wolves, and I'm not sure this year what the status is of aerial hunting in Alaska. I'm sorry, I don't know that answer. But the only way we're going to really wipe out wolves that I can see doing a big damage is to have a big poisoning campaign, because that's how we got rid of them the first time. I mean, they were shot and they were trapped, but it was the blanket dispersal of poisoning out on the landscape that killed them off. That's what did it.
Sure. What kept the Mexican wolf and the gray wolf from breeding 200 years ago?
That's another really good question. So they had enough diversity. There was geographic separation. I'm sure there was a little bit of blending between the southern end of the gray wolves and northern end of the Mexican wolves. It has to be. I mean, there isn't just a fence. However, there were so few Mexican wolves left by the time that the last handful was taken in captivity that they had been isolated long enough that they were noticeably different. And genetically, they are a unique subspecies of wolf. They are different. Morphologically, they look different. They eat kind of the same food. They eat elk and deer and everything, javelina, whatever. But they are different. And I wished I had a better answer, except to say that by the time we collected the last few, they were quite different, and they lived different lifestyles, and they lived in different habitat, and they had slightly different behavior. But it's kind of a squishy answer. I don't have a solid answer. Sorry.
Sure. We do have a comment from James that says, since Mexican wolves are not showing genetic problems, those of us working on Mexican wolf recovery are very interested in preserving the integrity of the Mexican wolf before allowing wolves of Canadian origin to genetically swamp the uniqueness for which they are listed separately.
So the Canadian origin, he's talking about the super wolves with the 8 canines, and they weigh 160 pounds and they're really aggressive. So Jim works on the Mexican wolves and we're collaborators. So I know that's what I said. The dilemma is they are working very hard and successfully to maximize genetic diversity in the Mexican wolf population. It's the top priority for that population, probably. They're doing the great job. But the only way you're going to get new genetic material is to have it mixed with a gray wolf. And then, like I said earlier, you will no longer have the pure Mexican wolf. So that's the dilemma. There's not an answer except to say that they are doing a very good job in maximizing genetic diversity. But when you start with 5 breeders, potentially 7, it just can't go on forever without some inbreeding. Problems like happened in Sweden, like happened on Isle Royal. Despite your best intentions, it can't go on forever.
Are there any wild Mexican gray wolves in Mexico?
Yes, there are actually. And this is of interest because I know a Mexican wolf biologist who has claimed that they were never extirpated from Mexico, that there's not camera proof of that. But in addition to that claim, as an aside, the Mexican government has been actively participating in the captive raising and release into the wild of Mexican wolves. I think there's about 25 or so, or 30 in Mexico now. And I guess we don't have to say it, but building a border wall between the two countries is going to further serve to sever genetic diversity.
How would you rate the value of captive wolf habitats in order to educate the public as to the importance and true biological facts regarding wolves?
That's a highly personal question for anybody, including the asker and me. I've got friends who did a ambassador wolf program for the life of their wolf. 15 years they did that, and they did a really good job. Does that represent a wild wolf? Yeah, kind of. They did a really good job in their program. And I don't know what to say with that. The International Wolf Center has got a fabulous wolf display there. I mean, I'm very, very impressed. They provide them good habitat. There's a lot of places that have captive wolves. You know what? For most people in the United States, that will probably be the one way that they can actually connect with a living, breathing wolf. So it has value. I don't know how to answer that question. Do you want to re-ask it, or did I cover it?
I think you covered it. I will just ask how you would like to handle these. We have a few questions about red wolves and their population. Would you like to go into that, or would you rather stick with gray wolves in the Montana area?
I'd rather stick with gray wolves because that's my expertise. And there are people out there who do red wolves. If it's a real general question, like what's going on with red wolves and coyotes, I can answer that a bit, but it kind of depends on what the question is, but that is not my expertise.
Both of the questions are about their populations and the current crash and their potential long-term survival.
I guess we can say it's not looking very good for the red wolf, unfortunately.
Your audio is cutting out just a hair.
Sorry, I'm probably losing my voice. It's not looking very good for the red wolf because they're inbreeding. There's introgression of coyote genes, and there's a lot of coyotes, and there's not very many red wolves. And humans are mistakenly shooting red wolves and claiming they thought they were coyotes. So there's a lot of things working against the red wolf, despite tremendous effort to help them out. It's a really unfortunate situation.
And I think we will wrap it up with one last question of, do you have a favorite wolf story you'd like to share? Or are you going to save it for your book?
Save it for the book. I mean, I could talk all day about wolf stories. It's just, there's so many. Sorry, I've been doing this a long time. And I could tell one from my first naive summer up in northern Minnesota, working I was working out of North Home, and I was helping Steve Fritz with his PhD work and depredation control trapping when there's livestock issues, and I had caught 3 pups that were right on the borderline of being too small to radio collar, but big enough to wear a radio collar. So I didn't know much about wolves. This was 1979. I mean, I was just a kid, and I got all 3 of them, and I didn't drug them because I didn't want to drug them because they were small. They were like 30 pounds. And I kind of put a little wrap of electric tape around the muzzle that they could pull off easy without pulling off the fur. And I tied their feet. And then I put them all in my pickup truck on the front seat. And I drove to a payphone at a little small rural gas station. And while I was on the payphone calling Steve Fritz to ask what to do, I saw a crowd gathering around my truck, people from farms and whatever. And I looked towards my truck through the people, and I could see wolves bouncing inside my truck. They'd all gotten loose. And I said, "Sorry, Steve, I got to go. I'll catch you later." And I went over, and all 3 wolves had gotten loose, and they were running around like pinballs inside of the front cab of my truck and chewing on the steering wheel. Anyway, I learned a lot from the wolves every time I'm near them. That was a good lesson.
Awesome. Diane, that was great. And again, we have lots of really great comments that this was just fabulous and super informative, and people really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for taking the time and for sticking with us for a whole extra half an hour, and to all of the people who stuck to it.
I hope my goal was to give information about what's happening in Montana, and then put out a bunch of feelers to make people think, because we all have to be expanding our horizons on what we think. Midwest is different than Montana, is different than Colorado, is different than Canada. Wolves have to find a place to live. We have to be more open-minded about stuff.
Great. Well, thank you again. It was really great, and many more questions or comments are coming in about how awesome this was. So thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.